It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, France 24 correspondent Sonia Ghezali. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Victor Mallet, Paris bureau chief of the Financial Times, is with us as well. How are you?
Good. Good evening.
Good to see Régis Le Sommier, senior correspondent for RT France. Your latest documentary, Kabul, Inside the Heart of the Taliban, filmed in July, edited in a hurry.
Yes, right after.
Is on the French platform Canal+. Thank you for being with us. And from Newcastle in England, Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. Judah, where does one find World Politics Review?
As always, at worldpoliticsreview.com.
Thanks for being with us. And don't forget, by the way, to subscribe to the audio version of The World This Week on Apple Music, Spotify, or whatever your favorite podcast platform is. They were chased out 20 years ago on Tuesday at Kabul airport. The Taliban were celebrating their return at a time with seized U.S.-built military hardware. Sonia Ghezali, we heard on sister station Radio France International your heart-wrenching report earlier this week with people in the capital, Kabul, hearing the celebratory gunfire and scared of what was happening and what's still to come.
I'm sorry.
Can you hear me, Sonia?
No, I can barely actually hear you. Can you repeat, please, your question?
No, because we heard your report earlier this week where you spoke to people in Kabul when the celebratory gunfire was going off and how scared they sounded.
I'm sorry, I can barely hear you.
All right, we're going to try to fix it, Sonia, and get back to you in a short while. The final leaving of the U.S. and the scenes of celebration. By the way, Régis Le Sommier, in Kandahar, which is the southern heartland of the Taliban, there was even a military parade with U.S. vehicles. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I was not surprised. I was surprised to see the amount of material taken from the U.S. military, taken actually from the Afghan army or the ANP, Afghan National Police, but U.S. material. But when I met the Taliban in July, they had already taken over tons of small arms. It was almost, incredible because you could see hundreds of Taliban with no AKs. All the weapons were M4, M16. You had no more the old-style Taliban with AK. Of course, you saw them parade with AK in.
And were these weapons won on the battlefield, or were these weapons that were?
Well, not some of them were won on the battlefield. We saw some outposts that were taken where they had heavy firefight over there. But most of them were taken, were left by the Afghan army. The Taliban showed us an entire container full of weapons that had just been, it was just as if the container arrived at Kabul airport and was given to the Taliban, and nothing had been touched in it, and it was full of ammunition, full of weapons, all American-made, and of course they would pride themselves in showing to us that the Taliban commander said, "We've taken these weapons from the Americans and we're using it. We were using them against them," and he was very proud of that.
So the writing was on the wall, Victor Mallet, and yet there was all this surprise on August 15th.
Yeah, I was last in Kabul 6 or 7 years ago, and it was clear then that this war was going nowhere. So in a way, this has been a very long time in coming, and no one should be very surprised.
Well, they were surprised by how fast it was.
Yeah, and as you said, in the last few weeks, the French, of course, famously anticipated the fall of Kabul, at least the rapidity with which the Taliban would come, and they started getting people out in May and June and July, and they got quite a lot of people out, although they still, of course, were taken aback by the very rapid sort of advance in the final days on Kabul, and they had to get out even more people.
And you penned a piece this week saying how the French, some said to them, because you got your Afghan staff out in July, You must have had some special intelligence.
Yeah.
And they said, no, we
Yeah.
were reading the same intelligence.
Yeah, and as Regis was saying just now, the Taliban were very close to Kabul, and most people who were in Afghanistan could see this coming.
So why did the Americans have a blind spot?
I think the assumption is that they were so heavily invested in the Afghan army. It wasn't just that they underestimated the Taliban, it was more that they overestimated the ability or the willingness of the Afghan army to sort of stay where it was and to carry on defending Kabul and the other cities. And basically, as we all know, the Afghan army simply melted away, as Biden was complaining the other day. But in a sense, they'd invested so much money and time and effort in sort of building up the Afghan army that they came to believe, that it was actually a thing that was worth preserving and would sort of hold the line for at least a few months. And that turned out to be completely wrong.
The last U.S. soldiers hopping aboard the last flight one day earlier than announced on Tuesday. 20 years, more than 2,300 casualties for the Americans, and $1 trillion spent. The U.S. president, there you see the picture of that last soldier getting on board the plane. The U.S. president taking stock in a speech that capped the day.
This decision about Afghanistan is not just about Afghanistan. It's about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries.
Judah Grunstein, is it a turning point for the United States?
Well, to the extent that it's the historic end of the war, yes, but at the same time, it's a turning point that's been a long time coming. U.S. foreign policy and national security is sort of like an oil tanker. When it turns, it takes a long time to turn. And we've seen this coming for at least the past 12 years. I mean, Barack Obama's presidency was based on trying to extricate the U.S. from these engagements, even if he was unsuccessful in doing so. Then you had Donald Trump, who was much more vocal about being very critical of the United States' approach to interventionism, but also its foreign policy and being forward positioned around the world. I think Biden is a much more classic American president in terms of his commitment to U.S. alliances, in terms of his perception of the best way to protect and advance U.S. interests abroad. But this rejection of the big military footprints, especially in the Middle East, has been a long time coming. I think it's also important to say
a long time
that it's
coming,
not
but let me ask you, Judah, how far can it get? Because there's a lot at stake, isn't there? When you militarize, in effect, your foreign policy, there's a lot of money at stake.
Well, there's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of sunk costs. There's also a lot of muscle memory. This is what the U.S. knows how to do. I think it's also misleading to suggest that this is the end of U.S. military engagement. Notice he said big footprint, but the U.S. just recently sent a counterterrorism training and advise mission to Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. It's still engaged in Somalia. It's still engaged in West Africa. It's still engaged around the world with this kind of operation. It wouldn't surprise me, as shocking as this is going to sound, but it wouldn't surprise me if first of all, the United States will continue to be engaged in Afghanistan to protect its own interests in the event of intelligence of a terrorist strike. But it wouldn't surprise me to see the United States enter into at least a tacit, if not a formal, relationship of cooperating with the Taliban in counterterrorism. The Taliban, throughout the negotiations in Doha, used the existence of ISIS, Khorasan, to sort of say, look, we can't go too far and be too reasonable because we've got this threat on the right that we have to take care of. I think they'll continue to try to leverage that. Look, we want to deal with ISIS, but we need your help. That sort of approach. So it wouldn't surprise me to see the U.S. engage in some sort of cooperative effort there as well. In terms of how realistic it is to demilitarize U.S. foreign policy, it's like former Defense Secretary Robert Gates said, unless you give the Pentagon, unless you start giving the State Department more money, you better give me way more bullets. The budget says it all, and in Washington, the Pentagon gets something like I think 10 times the budget that the State Department does yearly. So until that changes, it's going to be a very hard habit to break. But I think that any president at this point will think long and hard and have a lot of political opposition to engaging the U.S. military in an open-ended, big footprint conflict or war without some sort of exit strategy and without a real credible case that this is very central to U.S. interests.
And what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is the Taliban insisting that it's not the same as before, that times have changed. There was much fanfare around a cricket match that took place earlier this week. Now, a Taliban spokesperson insisting those times have changed when he sat down with France 24's Cyril Payen in Kabul.
Problem with them and those who took up weapons against us and fought. We forgive them as well. They are our professionals and Afghanistan's future will be in their hands. They should not leave the country. We welcome them. They are our heroes. They should not be worried.
Sonia Ghazali, we've all been covering this PR charm offensive by the... Oh, we've lost Sonia again. So the Skype gods are not with us, it seems. Régis Le Sommier, your thoughts on the Taliban circa 2021?
You mean, are they really Taliban 2.0 or are they new Taliban? Well, from what I've seen, spending some time with them in July, is that we attended, for instance, a Sharia court. And Sharia court is very widespread in the countryside and especially in Taliban territory. It's actually when you ask the judge if he's delivering like verdicts saying let's chop the hand of a thief or hang somebody or throw stone at a adultery couple, then he says directly, I don't have the power to do that, but there's a special court who can do that. So he says the Sharia has not changed; it's forever. So when I ask him, are you going to apply laws that are as ruthless as the one applied by the former Taliban? He said, no, we're just going to apply the Sharia. So they're finding every time a shelter with saying we'll apply the Islamic law. But then when it comes to looking at what they really do, you have the judge at the court, and then next to him you have somebody hiding his face, who's the guy actually delivering the punition. So it's really exactly the same. Now you have some Taliban youth that speak English because they went to university. Problem is they couldn't find any jobs, so they went back to their hometown, and Taliban paid them. Taliban paid very well, better than the Afghan army. That's another thing. You talked about the Afghan army, the question of being demoralized, and when I've spoken with Afghan army soldier, they said, we haven't been paid in 3 months. We haven't seen our family in a year. Well, the Taliban are not acting like that. They've taken the other, their fighters were very happy to be with them. They were they were really conquerors. What we've seen is people that saying, they make me think of Red Khmer, like ready to rush towards Kabul at that time. It was 3 weeks before the fall of Kabul, and it was incredible in a way and very scary in another way.
But it's been more of a political victory than a military victory. You said it yourself with the fact that the Afghan army just seeps away and
The problem now is they have to govern.
Yes,
I mean, it's very interesting to see. They obviously don't want all the skilled people to go to America or to France or to run away, which is what's happening. And they're looking at themselves and thinking, well, we actually don't want to lose power this time because we're hosting Al Qaeda. We want to run the country, and they're discovering, I think, very rapidly that it's going to be quite hard to run the country, except by running it in a reasonably modern way, which will mean international contacts, which they didn't have before, and they're going to have those contacts. And in order to have those contacts, not just with the United States, but with everybody else, they're going to have to run a reasonably kind of sensible government with an economic policy and everything else. And they're only just beginning to come to terms with that.
They have really very good networks within the country. Like, for instance, we went to Jalalabad, so in the east, close to Pakistan. Jalalabad, the negotiation with the authority, the governor, of course, the governor we met said, there's no Taliban in my area. The government army is controlling everything. The guy was already in talks in July with the Taliban to surrender the city. The city, 2 months of talks, and the city, the third city in
Again, with
Afghanistan.
few shots fired.
Very, very few shots. And Kandahar, same thing.
So it brings us back to Judah's point, which was Judah's point, which is that now the Taliban are probably going to cooperate with the Americans in fighting ISIS-K.
They've said also to civil servants, stay and do your job. They've even in Hazarajad, which is the territory run by the Hazara, they've named an Hazara governor. They claim that Uzbek will be the third official language of Afghanistan. That was not the case back before 2001. So they're trying to, and they put in place people like the mayor of Kabul is the same guys as before. So, they want to play a card of inclusiveness, if we can say.
Is there going to be a civil war with the resistance in the Panjshir Valley and the Tajiks, or not necessarily? I mean,
they're claiming this Friday that they now control all of the country.
Yeah.
But whether Panjshir, like during the time of Massoud under the Taliban, if Panjshir stays and is able to resist, there's no way the resistance, as I've heard some people say over in France, that the resistance could come from Panjshir and spread out to Afghanistan. I think the resistance could come more from cities who have been westernized for a long time. And you see these women that are demonstrating openly in the street. These women don't seem to be afraid of the Taliban, even though they risk a lot of things. And the Taliban, when they see so many women, claiming their rights, well, that could be a way to make them think twice instead of, applying what they did, in 1996. Remember the fall of Kabul, lots of hanging, lots of people being shot in stadium. So these scenes we haven't seen this time around.
Yeah, those women demonstrating, there's not many of them, but still, they were out there, Judah Grunstein.
And Régis just touched on it. The first is that Afghanistan, three things really. Afghanistan isn't the same country that it was 20 years ago. As much as the U.S. intervention and 20-year-long war and nation-building campaign ended in failure, it didn't have zero impact. It didn't leave the country exactly the way it was before. There has been a lot of development. There has been a lot of westernization. People get used to things like having their daughters educated. And now what they'll want is actually an economy where their children, daughters, and sons alike can get jobs. The second thing is, the Taliban is not necessarily the same as it was 20 years ago, and especially even 5 years ago, I'd say. They've kind of professionalized their diplomacy. They got savvy. I think the negotiations and the engagement with the U.S. diplomatic team in Doha probably wore off a little bit. I think being received in Moscow and in China had an effect. So their public communications have been incredibly savvy and much different. And the third thing that I think is very, very important that hasn't gotten a lot of discussion because of the focus on the U.S. and on the Taliban and on Afghanistan, which is important, obviously. But the surrounding region is not the same as it was 20 years ago.
Not the same as it was 20 years ago. We're going to have to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. With us is Financial Times Paris Bureau Chief Victor Mallet, Régis Le Sommier, Senior Correspondent for RT France, your latest documentary, Kabul, Inside the Heart of the Taliban. And from Newcastle, Judah Grunstein, Editor-in-Chief of World Politics Review. We were talking about all that's changed in the 20 years since the last incarnation of the Taliban in command, Judah. Most notably, how the surrounding region has changed.
Yeah, just real quickly, really. When you look at really all the major countries and even the neighboring countries to Afghanistan in the past 20 years, if you look at Central Asia, none of those countries are necessarily standouts, but 20 years ago, they were barely post-Soviet fragile states. Now they do have some military and security capabilities that have been nurtured by Russia. If you look at Russia 20 years ago, it was just entering ending the decade of humiliations and entering the Putin era. It's obviously in a much different position now. Same goes for China, same goes for Turkey, which was just entering the Erdogan era. Arguably, the only neighboring country that's demonstrably weaker right now would be Iran or and Pakistan, potentially. But in other words, there's much more capacity around Afghanistan, first of all, to contain whatever instability people are worried about, the fallout from instability in Afghanistan seeping out over borders, but also to try to work with and influence the Taliban. So I think that all those things combined suggest that that the history has not been written yet, that there will be a lot of continuity with the past, and that radical revolutionary movements tend to be pretty brutal when they take power. But we'll see how it goes in terms of an evolution and in terms of what kind of leverage the neighboring countries, the region, and the international community can have with the Taliban.
And Victor Mallet, just very briefly on this, we've seen a flurry of diplomatic activity. The last time I think it was something like 4 nations only recognized the Taliban. This time it's looking like it's going to be a lot more. We've seen to those neighboring states go the UK Foreign Secretary this week. We've also seen the German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas. He went to Turkey, Qatar, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan. There is this feeling that this time around there's a lot more countries with a stake in it.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the most interesting country that Judah mentioned was probably China, which on the one hand is delighted to see the rise of a government that is anti-American and has basically screwed over the Americans, defeated the Americans in Afghanistan, and also made life very difficult for India, which is of course a big rival of China's. But at the same time, what everyone should not forget is that China is also, the Chinese Communist Party is sort of viscerally opposed to Islamists, and especially to Islamic separatists, Islamist separatists in the west of China. And obviously there are ties between Al-Qaeda, between the Taliban and that kind of Islamist movement in Western China. So they're in a dilemma in a sense. They obviously want to take advantage of the situation, but they're also aware of the potential for instability that they're very concerned about.
For the first time, we're going to change topics and look at domestic U.S. policy. For the first time since the U.S. Supreme Court legalized abortion in 1973, a U.S. state has made it all but impossible for a woman to terminate her own pregnancy after 6 weeks. That's often before a heartbeat's even detected. The Texas law encourages private citizens to sue not only abortion providers, but also those who help. Other conservative states aim to follow in kind. Now, most striking in all this is the U.S. Supreme Court. With its 3 Trump appointees by 5 justices to 4, it ruled against any emergency freeze of the bill until challenges have made their way through the lower courts. And that, in turn, this Thursday prompted a strong statement from the U.S. president. He called it an unprecedented assault on a woman's constitutional right under Roe v. Wade. That's that 1973 ruling, which has been the law of the land for almost 50 years. Judah, part 1 of our discussion, I asked you whether or not the U.S. was at a turning point on foreign policy. Is the U.S. at a turning point domestically?
With regard to abortion, I think certainly. I think that this is the first, if this is successful, even in temporarily, I think you'll find other states trying to model, to follow the model. What's insidious and sort of unprecedented about this law is that it makes something illegal, but to get around the constitutional limitations on what a state can do, it says the state will not actually enforce the law, but private citizens can. And for people who are unfamiliar with the history of segregation in the United States, or even the infringement on voting rights for Black Americans in the South, even after segregation, that was the playbook in the South. It was once there were constitutional rights and laws that the government could not transgress, they left it into private hands to do so, whether it was the Ku Klux Klan or local citizens intimidating Black Americans who were going to try to sign up to vote. We see the same kind of approach taken here. And in the context of just the developments that we see in America these days, with this kind of tendency and trend toward taking the law in one's own hands, whether it's the storming of the Capitol, we've seen these sort of really contentious school board meetings over school curriculums, and now this. And in some ways, it suggests that there's a real crisis in governance in the United States in terms of one part of the country that really looks to government to do more, whether it's fiscally, whether it's the budgetary supports, whether it's eviction moratorium or mask mandates, and then another side of the country that expects the government to do very little and let citizens take the law into their own hands. So do we have a turning point in the U.S.? Yeah, I think we'll look back on this, depending on how it plays out, and think this was a harbinger.
A harbinger, perhaps. Here in France, it's got all the trimmings of an unofficial re-election campaign kickoff. Incumbent French President Emmanuel Macron taking 7 ministers with him for a 3-day visit to Marseille, a city beset by inequality, long-time mismanagement, and a drug-related turf war that's left at least 15 killed since the start of the year. As you can hear from those jeers, it wasn't all applause for Macron when he visited the rough northern neighborhoods of the Mediterranean port city. The locals are fed up with crime, crumbling infrastructure, and the all too familiar sight of politicians making promises. All right, Emmanuel Macron, they're promising a grand rescue plan, Régis Le Sommier. What do you make of this 3-day visit? First of all, is this the campaign kickoff?
It's definitely the campaign kickoff.
And why Marseille then?
Well, because Macron likes Marseille. He's a big fan of Olympique de Marseille, and he said yes. So he said he likes this city very much, even though he comes from the north. But that's the first in that is that you see a sitting president coming to rescue, literally, a town where everything is going wrong. It's not the first time French government have come to support Marseille because of crippling criminality, unhealthy environment, school environment, and all that. But before, it was mostly prime ministers acting, prime ministers giving money. And of course, most of the time, the money was mismanaged by the local authority and was sometimes even given back to the state. So there was no real investment, and we're discovering that.
How does this play politically? Why going to Marseille? How does that win him votes for a general election?
Well, he could win on one level because what is going to, putting funds in school is not going to play out in the next year's election. However, on security, there is a huge demand of security. He promised 300 more policemen in the streets in Marseille. So if he's able to tackle the drug traffic over there, which is huge, and we've seen in the past week, drug dealers actually setting checkpoints in places, asking people who enter the neighborhoods almost their identity, checking their identity, or saying if you abide by our laws, then you're allowed to enter the city. I've never seen things like that elsewhere in France. We've seen very tough neighborhood, but this time around, what's happening in Marseille is unseen. So if
that was strongly denied by Macron this Friday. When he spoke with the police, he said there are no-go zones in Marseille for the French police.
Yeah, but that's but what Macron is betting is on bettering the security in Marseille, of giving a kickoff, of reconquering what's called the lost territories of the Republic, which are not nearly in Marseille, but everywhere in France. You have some times of turf, which are very, very difficult for the policeman, but also for the firefighter, also for the ambulances, for everything that has a uniform. So if he's able to turn the tables around, then that could be a kickoff, kickoff for his campaign. Now, coming next year, his opponents are going to say, what has been the result in Marseille? So he's playing a risk. I mean, he's taking a risk, I think, in launching his campaign that way. And making also, which is an element of weakness, I think, making Marseille is the second city in France. Can you imagine a president has to come to a city with all ministers to say, we're going to rescue this city, and it's the second city in France? That doesn't play very well for his balance sheet coming to an election year.
He did more than that when he spoke. Let's listen to Emmanuel Macron talking about how, Marseille may be a world unto itself, but this is important for the rest of the country.
I fully accept that it's the nation's duty to stand by the people of Marseille. I think that helping Marseille to succeed today is not just giving it a handout. It's helping to spur on something that's there and that's good for the whole country.
Is that winning rhetoric, Victor Mallet?
Well, I think he was quite clever because, apart from sort of going to France's second city and getting out of Paris and as Reggie said, he's clearly starting the election campaign. He also made it clear that he wasn't going to hand out a blank check. This wasn't going to be money for nothing. He wasn't just going to hand over $1.5 billion or 1.5 billion euros to the city of Marseille. He was going to make sure that the money was well spent. That goes down well with the right. So I think he also said categorically several times, this is not about Paris handing down a rescue plan for Marseille. That's not what we're about. We're going to cooperate with the people of Marseille and the mayor of Marseille, who of course is a socialist. So I think he's played it quite well, actually. I mean, I don't think he's been,
because it seems very Regalian, doesn't it?
Yes,
the president
it does.
with his court
of course,
coming to the provinces.
But he went out of his way to make sure that it looked as little like that as possible.
Right.
By bringing Benoît Payan, the socialist mayor, on board. So I think who can't really refuse this money to help schools that are crumbling. So I think it's clearly a start to the election campaign, and he hasn't played it that badly. And the key thing is to not be seen as a Parisian elitist, and to get out into the countryside, which he's been doing before this, but this is obviously the first big sort of stop on the campaign as it really gets underway.
And it happened just in the days when France went back to school this week. Also back to school, China, where pupils discovered new textbooks peppered with Xi Jinping thought. That wasn't, we can perhaps show you the images of that. There you see in the new textbooks. It wasn't, by the way, the only novelty. The government announcing a ban on minors playing video games for more than 3 hours a day, a decision that's got the stamp of approval from many a parent.
The playing only causes physical and health issues for the children. Even their eyes suffer. I hope this national decision will last a long time.
Judah Grunstein, do you wish you lived in a country where the government put curbs on how much your kids could play video games a day?
Actually, I was just thinking that when my eldest son, who's now 20, finds out about this, he's going to look at me and say, wait a minute, you were stricter than Xi Jinping? Because he didn't even get 3 hours a day. Certainly not on school night.
3 hours a week.
Well, he didn't get that either.
Okay.
But in any case, no, obviously I don't. I think that what your introduction says it all. There's Xi Jinping thought, and then there's everything else that follows out from that. What we've seen over the last 5-10 years is the emergence of a cult of personality, a much greater centralization of power, both in the Communist Party's hands, but also in Xi Jinping's hands. It's very opaque, so we can't say definitively that he's running the show entirely alone. He certainly is the strongest Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping, at least. And the key also is that this kind of crackdown on internet usage or on video game usage is following in a whole string of state crackdowns, whether it's on Alibaba, whether it's on Didi, the ride-sharing app, on tech companies, on the financial tech sector, things like that. Basically, the Chinese state is laying down the marker, first of all, that it will tolerate the emergence of no competitive pole of power to the Communist Party. Of course, that's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is, I think, more interesting, is that in terms of Chinese tech policy, there's been a real emphasis away from apps, platforms, consumer-facing applications like video games, and toward more strategic applications and technologies in sectors like chip making and AI and things that are really hardware or that are much more strategic in terms of national power in a way that these apps aren't. So I think
these
that
apps aren't.
The crackdown on video games is in that line.
Of course, there is an important sociological element to all this. It was coupled with a curbing as well of private tutors because these kids, they've got long school days.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is what Judy was saying. It's about cracking down on the power of the technology companies. You know, these companies have grown up without being in direct competition with the American giants like Google and Facebook, because those companies are not allowed to operate in China. And it's a way of controlling Alibaba. And, you know, they've all been forced to hand over billions of dollars for Xi Jinping's kind of social projects in the last few weeks, actually. So we've really got a situation where, as Judah said, you know, the Communist Party is really trying to take all power for itself, and it's also very wary of promoting the kind of inequality that we see in China already, and we also see in the United States. So they're kind of trying to get everybody to it's kind of like, if you have capitalism, it's got to be capitalism for everybody. So the billionaires are being reined in very, very substantially. The big tech companies are being reined in very substantially. And we have a sort of Maoist cult of personality, which is really transforming China in ways that I don't think the outside world has quite gathered how serious this is.
Of course, China can control the internet, but good luck trying to control teenagers.
Some of my classmates may use their parents' ID to register for the games or buy a game account without restrictions, which isn't too expensive anyway.
Régis Sommier, who do you bet on, Xi Jinping or those teenagers?
No, I think that they're going to be, eventually they're going to be smarter. But I wonder about the school books, actually, as you know, Xi Jinping thoughts in the school books for you know, young kids, toddlers almost. Has there been, you know, other supreme leaders in, you know, printed in before, or is it the first time? Because it reminds me of Mao Zedong, actually.
Yeah, no, so I was saying it's like a return to Maoism.
Return to Maoism.
It is kind of North Korean in style.
Yeah, in a way.
Extremely.
Yeah.
I think it's very disturbing. And I don't think, you know, the outside world is quite. I mean, and this was it was greeted with a lot of hostility by Chinese parents in mainland China. You know, not just in Hong Kong, where obviously it's a big issue because until now education has been pretty free. But in mainland China, I mean, we quoted people, obviously not by name, but, you know, in mainland China who were saying, this is disgusting. I do not want my 10-year-old child to be subjected to this kind of nonsense. So, you know, it's not something that is popular with the Chinese people, I don't think at all.
All right, we're going to pick up on this in future editions. I want to thank you so much, Victor Mallet. I want to thank Régis Sommier, Judah Grunstein for being with us from Newcastle. We want to thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.